All right, and welcome everyone. Thank you so much for being with us today for the International Climate Policy Workshop session for our Sunday seminars. I'm going to be your host and MC to get us started here, Brett Cease, and I am CCL's Volunteer Education Coordinator. And we're so grateful for you spending time with us today and really being able to benefit from learning from our featured speakers throughout all of the workshop breakouts. I'm going to quickly introduce the wonderful board chair of CCL and tell you a little bit more about his background, as well as our co-presenter on the main line, Raven Graff, and then I'll pass the baton to them. But feel free to start putting any questions you have here in the chat, and we'll do a little review with some housekeeping after these bios. So please join me in welcoming the wonderful Dr. Ross Astoria. Ross is a professor of politics, philosophy, and law at the University of Wisconsin at Parkside. He also happens to be a long-term Citizens Climate Lobby volunteer and is serving as CCL's board chairman. He's also been the organizer in the past for CCL's Policy Boot Camp, which in years prior we held in DC the week leading up to the conference. This year, today's 2-hour session condenses 3 days of material into that same time frame. We also have the wonderful Raven Graff. Raven studies climate policy in the Masters in Public Policy program at the Harvard Kennedy School. They earned a BA from Swarthmore College in Bio and Chemistry. Raven stayed after graduating to work for Swarthmore's Office of Sustainability on carbon neutrality and climate education, and they volunteer with Citizens Climate Lobby as well as serve as Our Climate's board member to advance progressive carbon pricing solutions at the state and federal level. The floor is yours, Ross, and thank you all for joining us.
All right, thank you so much. So first thing we've got going on here is for about the first half an hour, you're going to be here with me, all of us together. We're going to do an overview of that part of HR 763 dealing with border carbon adjustments, and we will kind of direct that discussion, that overview towards how those border carbon adjustments are designed to do to facilitate climate diplomacy. During the next hour, we'll go into separate Zoom lines, and those breakout rooms will be designed to kind of do some of that climate diplomacy. So in those breakout sessions, be prepared for some more interaction than we're going to do in the first half hour here. And then when we're done with those breakout sessions, we're going to come back to this main line all together, and there'll be report out sessions where we will each learn about what the other was thinking about and doing during their breakout sessions. Okay, here's your exercise that you're going to be working on in the breakout sessions. The U.S. has passed H.R. 763. The U.S. Secretary of State is commencing climate diplomacy under Section 9910 of that bill. She is asking of the participating region or country what course of climate diplomacy that region or country would like to pursue with the United States. So our learning objectives for the next 20 minutes are at the end of this session. So learning objectives for the next 20 minutes, you will be able to describe the construction of the border carbon adjustment in 763, to identify the 2 conditions under which the BCA can or must be suspended, to articulate the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capacities, or the CBDR principle, reference the Sustainable Development Goals as a benchmark for evaluating domestic and international policy. And then by the end of the session, you will be a Zoom polling professional if you are not already. So let's take a look at the border carbon adjustment design. Now, as everyone on this line probably knows, a key feature of Citizens Climate Lobby's main ask is a border carbon adjustment. So what is that? It is a fee placed on certain goods imported from other countries or refunded to exporters from the United States. Now, keep in mind the environmental purpose of the border carbon adjustment is to prevent the offshoring of industry, which leads to an increase in greenhouse gas emissions. The term of art here is carbon leakage. So the environmental purpose of the border carbon adjustment is to prevent carbon leakage. That is important to keep in mind as we look at how we construct our border carbon adjustment. So next slide. So the main international agreement that governs the construction of a border carbon adjustment is the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or the GATT. There's a lot to say here about the GATT, but for today's purposes, we have to look at just two features. So a border carbon adjustment is compliant with trade law, with the GATT, only if there's a concurrent domestic carbon tax. So you can't have a BCA unless you've got a domestic carbon tax. The second feature that's important for today's discussion is the domestic carbon fee rate and the border carbon adjustment rate must be the same in terms of dollars per ton of CO2 equivalent. So the domestic rate and the charge at the border must be the same. So what does this mean? So it means that the border carbon adjustment is assessed upon the carbon content, sometimes called the carbon footprint, of the imported fossil fuel and carbon intensive products. So that means we need a life cycle analysis of the greenhouse gas emissions of either the fossil fuel or the carbon intensive product. And so the HR 7063 distinguishes between fossil fuels and carbon intensive products when it comes to the import and the export of products. So let's take a quick look at the next slide. And this is how the life cycle analysis for fossil fuels would work. So we've got a really great model here. It's called the Greenhouse Gases Regulated Emissions in Energy Use and Transportation Model, or the GREET. And the California has a low carbon fuel standard, and it's relied upon the GREET to build a table of the different carbon intensities of the fuels that are imported to and used in California. And this table here is just an excerpt of that. So you can see in the left-hand column, the name of the country. In the next column, the name of the crude oil that's being imported. In the third column, you see the carbon intensity of that fuel in terms of grams of carbon per megajoule of petroleum, and then the total volume of that fuel used in California. So in that list, you can see that it's pretty variegated as to the different types of fuels. So Canada, and I think you're looking at about half of the Canadian petroleums, but you can see carbon intensities all the way from as high as 21 grams of carbon per megajoule to 7.5 grams per megajoule. So the next slide is from the same table. But just a little bit down the alphabetical list. And in this slide, you can see two of the other countries participating in our exercise today. So the crude oil imported from Mexico and Nigeria are listed in those tables. One more slide on fossil fuels and petroleum. And this is just a graph of from the United States Energy Information Administration, and you can follow that URL and construct these types of graphs just for yourself. And here I just had it plot the petroleum imports from Canada. That's the top curve in blue, and then the other two curves are Mexico and Nigeria. So you can see the relative size of imports there. And then we'll take a look at carbon intensive products next. This is a little bit more tricky than the fossil fuels. So the border carbon adjustment applies to a carbon intensive product. And a carbon intensive product is a product that meets two criteria. First, it's emission intense and it's trade intense. So emission intensity is the ratio of the product's value in dollars to its greenhouse gas emissions. And we say usually that that product is emission intense when that ratio exceeds about 10%, but you can mess around with those percentages a little bit. And then the trade intensity. This is the proportion of the product that is traded internationally. And usually the cutoff point there is at about 15%. Now, carbon intensive industries are likely to be those that are vulnerable to carbon leakage. So distinguishing between carbon intensive and non-carbon intensive product aligns the border carbon adjustment with the environmental purpose. What are carbon intensive products? What some types of stuff here? Some of it's just the sort of stuff you would expect: iron, aluminum, paper pulp, cement, steel, the sort of things that seem to need a lot of energy and fossil fuels in order to produce. The next graphic here is a graph it's getting old now, but it's a 2009 study of carbon intensive products. And on that graph, on the horizon, you see energy intensity, and on the vertical, you see trade intensity. The bubbles represent different types of products. The size of the bubble is the amount of greenhouse gases produced by that industry, and everything to the north and to the east of the dotted lines is the carbon intensive product. So 39 and 40 up there in the top right corner is aluminum products. 22 is nitrogenous fertilizer. 36 is steel products. There are some stuff in here you probably wouldn't expect. Number 1, which has a very small carbon footprint, is malt manufacturing. So some non-intuitive stuff in there as well. And in the last, when we looked at fossil fuels, this next slide here is the imports of steel, one of the key carbon intensive products. So on this graph, you can see in the left-hand column the type of steel import, and then the origin, the country of origin for that import. And this is the top 5 sources. So you can see for most of those importers, you've got a couple of the participants in this webinar. So Canada, Mexico show up quite frequently in those lists. South Korea, Germany, and Japan as well. And I'll just note here that although China's exports of steel make the news a lot, it is not a big importer of steel to the United States, but Brazil is at least in one category. All right, so just a little brief overview of the types of products that count as carbon intensive. Let's move then from a kind of technical construction of the border carbon adjustment to climate diplomacy. We're going to take a little break here now, Brett, and we're going to take that poll. So if we can have that poll come up, and what I'd like you to do in this poll is if everyone could just tell us which breakout session you are intending to go to. Which breakout session are you intending to go to? Okay, thank you, Brett, and thank you all for the polling. And again, we'll have those Zoom lines at the end of the session. Now let's talk about climate diplomacy and border carbon adjustments. Now, the key case here, the key legal case for the construction of the border carbon adjustment is this case out of the World Trade Organization called U.S. Shrimp Turtle. Now, what happened in this case is that the United States, under its Endangered Species Act, listed the sea turtle as an endangered or threatened species. The United States decided that a good way to protect the endangered species, the sea turtle, was to prohibit the importation of shrimp that were caught in nets that did not have a turtle exclusion device. Now, the importers of shrimp to the United States challenged the border import ban, and the WTO came back and it said 2 things. The first thing it said is a country can use a border measure to achieve an environmental objective, but when it does so, it must in good faith negotiate international agreements on that environmental objective. Right, so basically the US in the shrimp turtle case did not reach out to other countries in order to try to figure out ways to achieve the environmental objective besides the border measure. So you got to do that. The second thing the WTO said is if you use a border measure to achieve an environmental objective, then the country using the border measure must allow other countries to meet the environmental objective with the policies and technologies of their choice. The country using the border measure must allow other countries to meet the environmental objective with the policies and technologies of their choice. And I love teaching this slide because that is the cutest turtle ever. But let us move to the next slide and see how the shrimp turtle informed the construction of the border carbon adjustment in HR 763. So if you go and look at section 9910C2, it says that the border carbon adjustment can be suspended by an international agreement, or in the next section, by a finding of the Secretary of State that a country has implemented policies which, in the case of a high-emitting country, reduce greenhouse gas emissions at a rate at least equivalent to the United States greenhouse gas emissions, or in the case of low-emitting countries, prevent the increase in greenhouse gas emissions. So you can see section C2 addresses the first condition that was given to us in shrimp turtle, and section C3 addresses that second condition. Next slide. And here you also have some language from HR 763. Says the Congress encourages the Secretary of State or the Secretary's designee to commence and complete negotiations with other nations with the goal of forming treaties, environmental agreements, accords, partnerships, or any other instrument that effectively reduces global greenhouse gas emissions to 10% of 2016 levels by 2050, and which respect the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. So in the next slide, let's take a look at that principle of CBDR and see what it might mean for our climate diplomacy here. So the principle of CBDR is in the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. It is also in some other international environmental agreements. So by including that language in the text of HR 763, the text kind of locates the work of diplomacy within the UNFCCC framework. Now, what the CBD principle says, it acknowledges that all countries have environmental responsibilities, but also recognizes that different countries have different capacities and responsibilities for meeting and addressing those environmental objectives. And in particular, one of the salient things that means is developing countries should not be expected to implement the same kinds of policies as developed countries. So we pull that into HR 763 with the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. Next slide is the Sustainable Development Goals. And you are going to meet with these Sustainable Development Goals in some of your breakout sessions. And so the Sustainable Development Goals were agreed to by the UN in 2015. You can see there are 17 of them. And it's a nice collection of goals that we as humans are trying to achieve. So no poverty, zero hunger, good health and well-being, quality education, gender equality. You can read through these yourself, but one thing to note here is virtually all of these are imperiled by global warming. That is, global warming will make it so that we cannot achieve these. Besides that, a couple of the development goals reference directly climate change. So number 13 is climate action. Number 7 is affordable and clean energy. Now, one thing that's nice about the Sustainable Development Goals is besides the goal itself, they each have a number of different targets that we're aiming to. So if you were to click through and explore affordable and clean energy, you would find that there is a target that by 2030 ensure access to affordable, reliable, and modern energy services. You also find some data there, some statistics that kind of show just how far short we have to go in order to get to that goal. So under affordable and clean energy, you'll discover that 1 in 7 people on the planet have no access to electrical power, and that 3 billion people cook with polluting fuels. So these the principle CBDR and the Sustainable Development Goals will show up in your breakout sessions. One last context for your breakout session here is in the slide here, and you have a map here from the World Bank's carbon pricing dashboard. And in that slide, you will see, probably most of you have seen this already, but you see those countries that have some sort of carbon pricing implemented or are thinking of implementing it. And that might be either a carbon tax or an ETS. And you can see that that is becoming a pretty extensive set of countries with some sort of carbon pricing, in addition to whatever other mitigation policies they might have in place. So only the United States and Russia seem to be the two largest countries here without some sort of carbon pricing. Okay, some take-home points here before we move into our breakout sessions. So carbon-intensive goods and fossil fuels entering the country are eligible for carbon border adjustment. 2, diplomacy will be required to integrate mitigation regimes between countries and across borders. 3, the principle of CBDR and the SDGs will inform the mitigation negotiations. And in the next slide, I'll just remind you of your exercise that you will be conducting in the next hour. The U.S. has passed H.R. 763. The United States Secretary of State is commencing climate diplomacy under Section 9910, and we're now seeing the language for that. She is asking of the participating region or country what course of climate diplomacy that region or country would like to pursue with the United States. So move to the next slide here, and you will drop off of this line and join your breakout room. You're going to get some great knowledge in there, but I just want to encourage you also to make sure you meet some people over there. Those are going to be some great new climate friends for you. That is all. Please go to your breakout room, and I will see you in an hour.
All right, so with that, I think we have who we are going to have for our breakout here. So I am actually just going to turn it over to the wonderful Joe Robertson, CCL's Global Strategies Director, and our Developmental Associate and CCL Diversity Outreach Coordinator, Princella Talley, to lead this session that's going to specifically be on the UN Conference of the Parties.
Well, welcome everyone to the United Nations Conference of the Parties breakout session during the CCL 2020 International Policy Workshop. As Brett said, my name is Joe Robertson. I'm Global Strategy Director for Citizens Climate. I'll be moderating this session today along with Princella Talley, who's our Diversity Outreach Coordinator and a vital member of our development and global teams. And of course, the brilliant and nimble Brett Cease is managing the technology. Thank you, Brett. Just going to go to a quick run through of today's meeting. We're going to spend a few minutes just going through the basics, the learning objectives and intended outcomes of this session. We'll go through some background on the UN process and the presentation of policy options and have a brief discussion about what those mean. Then we're going to have a poll like the one you did to select your meeting, where we will rank those 4 policy options or leadership strategies that we might recommend to the US. We'll have a 30-minute discussion about the reasoning for those rankings, and we'll go into some more detail about some of the nuances and background, sustainable development goals, common but differentiated responsibility, etc. And then we will rank those options again. And the reason is that we want to see if after that discussion, we have a different way of thinking about the power of different options. After we've done that, we're going to then sketch out a draft report back to the plenary session. And so in the role-playing aspect of today's simulation, Ross Astoria is the US Secretary of State. He's acting on Section 9910 of HR 763 and trying to make the US a diplomatic leader for climate stability. And we collectively, all of us together in this workshop, we are essentially the COP presidency team. We are the people who will be managing the negotiations. So our perspective is, how can the US play the most constructive role possible to make that intergovernmental negotiation a success? And that is what we're going to try to sketch out in that final report. What is our preferred option? What are some of its benefits? And how do we report back so that we provide useful insight to the US Secretary of State? And then we'll go back into the plenary and we will have that report back. So I just briefly want to share with you a little background here, setting the scene. The image you see on your screen is obviously not from this year. This was the 2018 annual UN climate negotiations. You see there was no social distancing. So this is why the UN climate talks are pushed back a full year. Instead of happening in November of this year, they're going to happen again in November of 2021. But what you're seeing here is a special event that was held by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And the purpose of that special plenary session was to present the findings of the IPCC special report on global warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius. The reason that that report needed to be presented was because it was actually requested by the COP, the Conference of the Parties, so by all of the parties to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, as part of the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement had said that we should be aiming to stay well below 2 degrees Celsius of global warming, or to aim for the higher ambition target of 1.5. But that was pending scientific review. So the IPCC did its scientific review. I'm sure many of you have not only read it, some of you are probably experts in the content of it. The thing that happened in that plenary session that was so stunning, you know, these big open plenaries, there are thousands of people milling around, 196 countries, plus the European Union, that's the 197 parties to the convention, the country delegates. Each of those parties may have a team of 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 people in that room. You then have dozens of UN agencies, thousands of observer organizations, all wanting to be in that big plenary session. And in this case, it wasn't like the usual plenary where there's a lot of buzz, a lot of people moving around, coming and going, a lot of typing, a lot of side conversations, and someone on the microphone holding everyone's attention, except for those buzzing around. This time, no one was buzzing around. Nobody was getting up and leaving. There was no chatter on the sides. Everybody was focused, silent, solemn, taking in this information. Countries that have consistently worked against success in the process were asking about their unique vulnerability, about how their country could soon run out of food. Countries that are major exporters of oil were asking those kinds of questions, asking how they're going to be able to have livestock, how they're going to be able to find fresh water, asking the other countries to think about that. The thing is, everyone in that room already knows this information. It's their day job. That's why they're there. So why was that room so silent and so stunned? And I think, and a number of other people, including some of the diplomats in the process, all sort of agreed that it's because we were in that room together, receiving that information. And it felt like somehow you're in the control room and you have this responsibility. We need to get the world on a better path. But there isn't enough help coming from governments. There isn't enough help coming from business and industry. The investment community is making great strides, but in December of 2018, it wasn't at all clear that that was going to happen. And so the feeling in that room was one of immense responsibility and a challenge that seems almost impossible. One of the reasons for that is that the intergovernmental space is set up so that nations essentially try to find ways to work together while also working in their national interest. And the Paris Agreement very much mirrors that standard. The Paris Agreement calls for nationally determined contributions to global climate action. So every country is required to put forward a national plan for solving climate change. Now, a little added note of context, the 1992 convention, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, mandates, the core mandate of that convention is to avoid dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. And it does establish common but differentiated responsibilities, meaning all nations are responsible for meeting that goal, but some are more responsible than others. Those that have historically generated more pollution and therefore more global warming should be more responsible, especially because those countries also tend to have more wealth and more technological capability. So there you have respective capabilities. The thing is, until the Paris Agreement came along, there was no universal model for how all nations could work together in a system of common but differentiated responsibility to achieve that goal of avoiding dangerous interference with the climate system. The problem we've had since 2015 is that that dangerous interference is already happening, and it's becoming more and more evident and more urgent. And yet, we still have that problem that countries don't always know how to simultaneously work for the common interest and work for their own interest. One of the reasons for that is the ways in which incumbent industries or the dominant industries of the current moment or of previous moments essentially have their own well-being built into national economies or into international trade. Changing that can be challenging politically and economically. It can be potentially painful politically and economically. So this becomes the sort of mystifying question. How can countries do that work together? We heard Ross share some very useful information about how border carbon adjustments can be helpful there. The goal of a border carbon adjustment is not to punish a country. The goal is to empower that country to do some of the same kind of constructive things that are going to help its economy be more carbon efficient and help it be a stronger leader on the international stage with respect to climate. But that kind of policy is not yet in place or driving change across the world. So that's why we are here today, to figure out how that can become possible. These are the learning objectives for this segment of the workshop, this breakout session. At the end of this workshop, we want all of you to feel comfortable describing the UN negotiation process under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, being able to detail the nationally determined and therefore also segmented process of the Paris Agreement, and to provide some judgment of its effectiveness at facilitating global collaboration on climate governance. And third, we want you to be able to reason through and predict the impact of national carbon fee and dividend legislation on the Paris Agreement process. There's some nuance to each of those points, but what I'd like to add for each of the three, and especially that question of evaluating the effectiveness of the Paris Agreement, is that there's a way to evaluate it, this sort of standard boilerplate, and say it's too hard for countries to do their own thing and also work together. We want there to be a little bit more thoughtful approach to that evaluation, because there are ways in which it certainly is the most powerful way forward. It's just a question of who goes first, what steps get us there. And that's part of what we want you to be able to talk about. So a little added context about this particular breakout. We're in a context where the climate crisis is deepening, costs are rising, and the world is not yet on track to reduce emissions quickly enough. Our goal is to advise the US Secretary of State, who in this exercise is acting on Section 9910 of HR 763, which calls for working with the diplomatic community to foster global climate governance, on how the US can be a stronger leader. We also want that leadership of the US to foster improved cooperation. So those are a couple of levels of what we're looking to be able to identify as leverage points or leadership strategies for the US. Now, here's the interesting question. These are just a few options, and we may come to another view of any one of these four. We may come to a view that there's some blending possible. But for the purposes of this workshop, we're going to ask you in a minute to take a poll. Before we put the poll up, I just want to go through them and let you think about these points. Which of these is a good leadership strategy for the US to engage with the COP process, which we in this exercise are collectively responsible for? We are the COP presidency. Which is a good strategy for the US to be able to push the world in the right direction and foster global cooperation for climate stability? Contribute our fair share or better to the Green Climate Fund. Build climate risk and impact into processes where the US is already a strong leader, like in the UN Security Council, where it has a veto, where it is a permanent member. Enact world-leading national climate policy, realigning major incentives and investments in all areas of the national economy and trade, however that might be done. Or 4, to catalyze private sector transformation in energy, agriculture, industry, and transport using incentives. Carbon fee and dividend is one example. And once it's in place, which it is in this exercise, there's the possibility that other such incentives follow. So quick run through: fund the Green Climate Fund, use geopolitical leverage, enact the world's best national climate policy from the government side, or catalyze private sector transformation using smart incentives. Now let's put that poll up and ask all of you to just vote. Which of these do you think is the most effective strategy the US can use to foster global climate cooperation? Sorry, Brett, are you able to put the poll up for everyone?
Yeah, we got about 58% already having gotten their returns in.
Oh, good.
I'll share the results here in just a moment, but I'm just going to make sure the last 20 people that haven't voted yet, if you're on your breakout window there for your browser rather, just click on which of those options you feel you want to represent as the UN Conference of Parties in this decision, and I'll share the results here in just 30 seconds. We've got only 10 people left to respond. So far, the split is about 50% the third option and 50% the fourth option. And for those that are messaging me that can't see the polls, if you're joining with a Chromebook or if you're joining with your phone, sometimes the app doesn't go through. So I'm guessing those that have seen this can do it. We apologize that the integration across all platforms for Zoom polls isn't perfect, but I'm going to end that poll and share the results. And the clear bottom two were the winners, so everyone can see that. It was 4% number one, 6% number two, and then an even split almost for 3 and 4 at 45% roughly.
Okay, so thank you, Brett. That's very important to know. So it looks like 4% said Green Climate Fund, 6% said use geopolitical leverage, and 45 each said world-leading national climate policy or catalyze private sector transformation. So one thing that we might want to think about is whether any of these could work together in a way that's particularly useful, because we are not obliged to recommend to the plenary session only one of these four. We're going to give our own report based on the outcome of this conversation. So I want to move to a quick discussion about what we've just polled on, and then I'll take down the slides so we can more directly interact with each other for this discussion in a minute. So again, Green Climate Fund, Security and Geopolitics, Economy-Wide NDC, Smart Incentives to Catalyze Private Sector Action. Those are our four options. 3 and 4 look like the strongest, but we want to hear not just why you think those are the strongest, or if you think 1 or 2 should be stronger and you feel like other people are missing something, we want to hear from you as well. We also want to look at those questions in the orange box. How can the strategy we're talking about transform the US economy itself to foster more climate-friendly national priorities? How will this leadership strategy motivate international cooperation? And also, will this strategy not only reduce emissions, but also address economic inequality? And is that, for instance, directly connected to what you see as the value? So just take a minute to take a screenshot or document those questions and think about the fact that we want to hear your reasoning for what you voted for. We want to hear answers to these questions generally as well. And now I'll just, oops. How do I get out of sharing my screen, I wonder? Go back here. Okay, so I'm going to stop the broadcast and go back to Zoom. And so now it's an open discussion. We want to hear from any or all of you. I know some of you personally and know you have huge wealth of information about everything I've said. I know some of this is new to some of you, but I know this is going to be an interesting discussion. So Princella, I might ask you if you can just make sure that anyone who hasn't had a chance to speak or might not get to because there's a limited amount of time, let's look for interventions in the chat. You're welcome to post whatever you like in the chat to share your thoughts in the background as we have this discussion. But is there anyone who would like to speak? You can raise your hand digitally, you can raise your hand physically, and if you're on my screen, I'll see it.
Yeah, and
I
just
see.
for you, I know we have Bill and Jan raising their hand here. For those that are on the line, it's in the instructions in the chat too. To raise your hand, you just click on the participants button. And then in the lower left of that, you'll see a new little icon that says raise hand. So at this point, Joe, I'll let you and Princella facilitate that, and I'm happy to unmute people, whoever you call.
Thank you. Bill, why don't you go ahead, and then Jan after Bill.
Okay, thanks. Good work. I voted for number 3 because I think reducing our emissions is the obvious first step. But I was very surprised that number 2 didn't get more support, because I thought that was the number 2 for the U.S. to lead. We ought to be using platforms where we have authority and we have good leadership already. I would think that the 4th one on developing technology, that's going to happen organically. That wouldn't be the real leadership platform.
Okay, that's interesting. And so I gather, Bill, that you chose, you didn't choose number 2, but you felt others might choose it, right? So there might be some insight in why you personally didn't choose it as well. But just to clarify points 1 and 2, there's been a question about point 1, the Green Climate Fund. And Bill, you raised an interesting point about point 2. In global trade or in the UN Security Council, the US has quite a lot of established power to cause others to focus on certain things. And so, for instance, if it were known that the UN Security Council was going to treat the failure to contain climate damage as a security priority, or as a human rights priority, or a cause for intervention of some kind, it might motivate some countries to change their energy practices. On point 1, the Green Climate Fund, the Green Climate Fund has as its purpose the raising of $100 billion in public sector investment each year to then be pushed into investment in mitigation, meaning reducing emissions, or adaptation, 50%, 50%. And the main purpose of the Green Climate Fund is to help fund that kind of smart climate transition in developing countries. So there's a way in which if the US were to commit fully to whatever its share should be, that would potentially create new diplomatic leverage, create a different environment in the negotiations, just as background. And then Jan, I know you had something you wanted to share.
Thanks, Joe. Can you hear me? Can anybody hear me?
Yep.
Okay. So, Joe, I think you did an excellent job introducing the subject. I voted for number 4, and I actually was reluctant to vote for anything because, in my opinion, we should replace in all these discussions the word or with the word and. I think it's extremely important because people look at one thing or another thing and they say, well, this won't work, and really we need many strategies in our portfolio. A good way to see this is with the En-ROAD simulator that MIT proposes using, and that's an excellent educational tool. So I would recommend that in order to see that we have to have that. So governments have the responsibility to lead in policy, but from a simply economic point of view, the amount of money that's necessary to transition into a renewable economy has to be provided by the private sector because governments don't have enough money. So governments can lead in starting the development and broad policy initiatives, but private enterprise and private capital will have to be the tools to actually implement all of this. At the same time, we have to recognize that the Green Climate Fund is our responsibility for underdeveloped countries. And the last thing I would just want to say is if you look at the common but differentiated responsibilities, argument so that the United States and the European Union have contributed about half the carbon dioxide that's in the atmosphere cumulatively to this point, so they have more responsibility. Nonetheless, when you look at the projections of what is going to happen to emissions under the NDCs of the Paris Agreement, it is also clear that the United States and the European Union will not be emitting most of the emissions going forward under those assumptions. And so we need to help underdeveloped countries, especially countries like India, leapfrog over using fossil fuel, that means coal, in order to establish more renewable energies. That means eliminating intellectual property restrictions. Anyway, there are a number of things to say, but I'll just stop there.
Yeah, thank you, Jen. I want to note a couple of things. First of all, I know, Warren, you're next, but just 1 second while I provide a couple additional insights here. We have that Climate Interactive En-ROAD simulator is linked in the chat for people who want to look at it later offline. It's interesting and time consuming, so not immediate for now. 2, what Jan pointed out, that we now know that the US and the EU are not going to be the majority of the world's carbon emissions going forward. There are a couple of ways to look at that. One of them is we're losing time. The longer we wait to leverage the influence we have, the less influence we're going to have. And that's not going to make the world a cleaner, safer place. Final point here would also be that something I didn't mention in the intro, the COP is not just one conference of the parties, it's actually 5 conferences of the parties at the same time. It's the conference of the parties to the convention. It's the meeting of the subsidiary bodies on implementation, subsidiary bodies of the convention. It's the meeting of the subsidiary bodies on science and technology. It's the meeting of the parties for the Kyoto Protocol, and it's the meeting of the parties for the Paris Agreement. There are 5 global diplomatic convenings happening at the same time. The reason that's important, because people were asking about who's leading the US discussion here in the international community now. Even if the US is not formally participating in the Paris Agreement talks, it's still participating in the others. And it's still listening in to Kyoto and Paris anyway. So that's an important detail. Even while we're in a simulation, this is also still the reality. Princella, you had an intervention.
Yes. So Joe, could you clarify who is leading the U.S. discussion now? This question comes from Kate. The intro screen said Secretary of State, but uses she as the gender. So not Pompeo?
We're in a kind of simulation environment, I think. I think that Ross is speculating that we're in a post-Trump environment, potentially, where we have a new Secretary of State. For the purposes of today's exercise, Ross is the Secretary of State, but he is also deferring to the possibility that the Secretary of State could be a woman in the future, as in the past. And yes, technically, Mike Pompeo is the most senior diplomat for the United States, and therefore would be the most senior US official involved in these talks. But usually the United States has an official climate envoy who's the lead negotiator. Right now, there isn't an official climate envoy, so the State Department has its own sort of career diplomats who are the ones who make sure that things are running smoothly and that we're adequately represented. I know, Warren, you were next, and there's another hand as well, which is, I guess, William after Warren. Go ahead, Warren.
Okay. I certainly agree with all the comments so far, particularly the one about all of the above as compared to or. But I just thought one perspective I have, at least, is that however we can, a lot of the power the U.S. has to influence economic participants around the world. Foreign governments respond to domestic politics in a large measure, not just what goes on on the international front. So if we can leverage the US trade power through what we do in trade negotiations to say, hey, we're going to put in place this carbon fee and dividend, you would be best off to do your own program, there to keep your trade flowing back and forth with the US without penalty, that we could encourage economic participants in China and the EU and so forth to put pressure on their governments to try to join in and get the ball rolling among all countries. I just think we ought to consider working through the structures we've got, but we also ought to consider trying to affect the domestic participants in each of these countries, what their incentives are. That's why I voted for 3, and I almost voted for 4. But those are my comments. Thank you.
I think that's great. Thank you, Warren. And you mentioned not only the domestic politics, but also how we sort of influence people within a country to change their own, to react to different incentives and see different goals as a priority and then pressure their own leaders.
Yes.
We're going to come back to that in a couple of minutes, actually. William, did you have an intervention? And then I know Princella has another she'd like to share. Go ahead, William.
You have to click on the unmute button now, William.
Yeah, I have to do it too. Well, I think that was pretty much my comment. When I look at those 4 possibilities, it's like, okay, you know, which one doesn't involve the necessity of reaching international agreements, international treaties, in order to effectuate them? Seems to me the first 3, you're aiming at some kind of international agreements. And I don't know whether that, you know, I could see with carbon fee and dividend, and you take unilateral action. The United States can pass this thing. And then through the border adjustment, you encourage other countries to participate as well. And then at that point, you can think about this idea of a club or some kind of international agreements under which all these countries could sort of begin to join the club and join this international group, but it's not absolutely necessary. So it seems to me what you want is a way of, you know, acting unilaterally that can then encourage international cooperation over time, but it isn't necessary to begin you know, working with other governments to try to find to form international alliances or international agreements. So that's basically my comment.
Thank you, William. That is interesting. And let's also keep in mind that here we're in a context, simulated context, where the US has passed fee and dividend, right? So it started that unilateral action. And now we are going to engage the US and say, based on that, how can you now use that leverage to foster more international cooperation? Some of them, like the Green Climate Fund, this has already been agreed to under the Paris Agreement. But that's an interesting point, that unilateral action is a leverage point. It's not a shortcoming. Princella, you had something.
Clarify if number 2 is just the Security Council or all areas that we are major leaders in, including trade.
Yeah, so that would be all areas, right? It's more a question of, can the US find ways to make climate risk and resilience part of all of these other discussions? Border carbon adjustments allow you to talk about trade, but there might be other ways to do that too. So those are 2 examples, right? There's the trade environment, there's the security environment. There might be others as well where the US could leverage its influence.
Yeah, I voted for number 4. I thought that, you know, ultimately governments are, you know, proving somewhat ineffectual in getting some of this stuff done. Industry is all the things that are making it happen. If we can lead by example, showing that industry will lead to something, and especially in combination with carbon fee and dividend, we have the ability to do something that we haven't been doing these last few years. And that's because our technology is transformative. And that particular one not only gives us an example of what it can do, but it shows the rest of the world that you can do that too. So that's why I was feeling that 4 is so important in the big picture.
Thank you. It's interesting. I've heard a couple of comments go in the direction of 4, which is sort of catalyzing transformation through the private sector, focus on technology. Jan mentioned capital investment, so not as much technology as investment, but there is also sort of common practice, how the landscape of society changes if the private sector's behavior and priorities are changing. I see we've got a couple of hands up, but I also see in the chat, Sarah shared, you voted for number 1 because large industry is not nationally bound anyway. Do you have anything further you want to add on that?
I could go on for a long time. I picked number 1, not because I think the others aren't important, they are, but because other countries, yeah, you said, did I want to add anything about large industry not being nationally bound? The big companies are not just regulated by the US. And I see that, I'm Canadian. You see that in the oil sands, they just shift around to where the governments give them money, especially the extraction industries. So, and the NDCs, it seems to be a painfully slow process, and time is short. So, and maybe that's just me not understanding how UN things work. Maybe it's not as slow as it looks from the outside. But yeah.
That's very helpful, Sarah. Actually, I think you've raised a very important point. I mean, it sounds like, and you can tell me if I'm wrong about this, but it sounds like you're saying that if the focus is on transforming the national economy, some of the big corporations that might be big polluters might reform things they do within those borders, but they might not reform things they do elsewhere. That might just push pollution elsewhere, unless there's an effort to condition investment elsewhere as well.
Yeah.
Is that?
Yeah, that's so, and the Green Climate Fund, and again, I don't know how it works, and I don't know, I don't mean to be cynical about this, but are there many funds like that where countries actually contribute what they said they will? I don't know.
That's a great question. There are often much more ambitious commitments or targets than there are actual investments. There are other similar funds. Many people thought when the Green Climate Fund was first introduced that $100 billion was an insane number that would never be approachable in terms of total climate investment across the world economy, let alone just from governments. But now, just, you know, our own team internationally in our Resilience Intel initiative has tracked over $6 trillion in outstanding commitments for climate-related investment from the private sector, multilateral development banks, and governments. One vision is that the Green Climate Fund could transition to be not a targeted fund for specific projects that have to be approved as being climate relevant, but that over time there would be a goal where all investment everywhere would be ranked for its climate friendliness or its climate safety. And that would, of course, give us a much bigger pool of investment to draw from. I know we've got 3 hands up, and I want to take these comments, and then I want to go back into a discussion briefly about the Sustainable Development Goals. But I think the sequence that they came up was Lawrence, and then Jessica, and then Warren. Lawrence, go ahead.
The economist Dean Baker has recently written about how many aspects of economic reform could be undertaken by Democrats, and one of them has to do with intellectual property rights and the fact that the United States, under the neoliberal regime rampage of recent years, has extended intellectual property rights beyond infinity, and that we're now in a war with countries like China over this, and that's totally counterproductive, and that reforming and limiting intellectual property rights, their original intention would be a huge and doable reform.
Great, that is a very important insight for sure. Jessica, did you want to go ahead?
Yes, I chose number 2 because I think that while it is important to take the lead within our own nation, it is also important to set that example for other leading nations. And for example, take the Security Council. In the Security Council, there are several nations like Russia who are very much world leaders. And I think that by bringing up this issue there is very important as well, because not only are we saying, yes, like this is something we're addressing within our own country, but this is something that other world leaders should address as well.
Thank you, Jessica. That is very important, right? There may be ways in which other powers respond differently in different venues than they do within the climate-related world. And I just want to recognize Richard. You were asking to intervene.
Yeah, thank you.
I haven't had a chance yet. Go ahead, Richard.
You hear me?
Yeah.
I would suggest 2 things. We want both the private sector and government to be involved. The private sector, I think, can be incentivized by the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act that the CCL is promoting. And I think also it can be and also supported by other things. But then I think the public sector needs to do more to subsidize research and development, and also to do more to deal with the urgent problems of inequality, both in the United States and around the world. I think we can do both, but both the government and the private sector are needed to deal with this very, very difficult problem we face.
Great, thank you, Richard. That is very important. And I see, Warren, you also have a hand up. You're muted.
Just a question, thank you, Joe, about the Green Climate Fund. I would hope, or I would think, that that fund would be designed in a way that would achieve the maximum emission reductions, which would mean it would be incentive. I don't know how it is. It's really a question. Is it designed to try to encourage countries like China, or is it meant to help people that can't have much effect on emissions, just to protect them? Selfishly, I'm saying selfish as the world, world viewpoint, I would think that we have to use whatever tools we have to get results as quickly as possible. And that means getting maximum emission reductions. And I'm just wondering if that fund is designed that way.
Sure, I think there was a big argument about that during the run-up to Paris, and the idea of people who felt it should be conditioned to get maximum reductions was it should be 100% devoted to sort of technology and mitigation. But then that left out the problem of adaptation, which is a real world cost also, right? If countries are vulnerable and they don't have any protection, we think of what happened in New Orleans, there are unmanageable costs there. One question would be, could the GCF be conditioned to deliver funds that are capable of catalyzing wider investment? So wherever they go, the funds are amplified and bring in more climate-friendly investment. And another is, of course, could it be somehow designed to ensure that those collateral actions are at least as good, if not better, in terms of their standards for emissions reduction or adaptation value? Those are some key metrics, and I think some of that is still under discussion. I want to just go back to sharing my screen for a minute, because I want to share with you all the Sustainable Development Goals. And I know many of you may be familiar with them, but I want to make sure that we're able to take a look at them directly up front. Let's see if I can, oh, there we go. Just head on. So you've got these 17 goals, and for some people, this is a very complex landscape. almost unmanageable. But when you think about all the things that need to change if we're going to have a sustainable world, a resilient economy, and a world where we have more equality and less income inequality, less of those things that cause damage and harm, it's a great map of some of the things we all have to aim for. So what I want to ask everyone to do, and you can just do this sort of privately offline as we're discussing, is select 3 of these other than number 13 that you think are complementary to climate action. And I'm asking you to have at least one of those 3 be something that isn't apparently connected directly to climate or energy. So just take a minute and for your own purposes, look at what those options are: no poverty, zero hunger, good health and well-being, quality education, gender equality. Look at all of these options, select 3 other than number 13 that you think are relevant to or would be complementary or helpful to driving climate ambition. And then let's see if we can continue this discussion about which of these 4 options is the best ranking and why, or what other considerations we might want to add into the discussion and continue our discussion. So I'll leave that there for just a minute. Again, while each of you think about this, and before we go back to the next poll, while we're continuing our discussion, just think about if your interventions could include sort of one line about why one or more of these things is useful for fostering climate cooperation. I'll just switch back out now, so we're all in the same Zoom meeting again. Jan with a hand raised. I just want to quickly check. Go ahead, Jan.
So the Sustainable Development Goals, I believe, are absolutely central to this whole discussion. And that's for a couple of reasons. One of the reasons is not so much in discussions with people politically on the right, but with people that are politically on the left. And the reason is that the reduction of economic inequality, the elimination of poverty, all of the other sustainable development goals that are desirable social justice issues for the left are connected with climate action in the sustainable development goals. So there is no long-term solution to any of these sustainable development goals without a solution to the climate problem. Climate change impacts everything. And once that's understood, then I think there's a much greater possibility for intersectionality and synergy in the discussions with, especially with people on the left. So I think the sustainable development goals are absolutely essential. Whenever you listen to somebody talk about the sustainable development goals, they say exactly what you said at the beginning, that there is no long-term solution to the elimination of poverty if you don't have a solution to the climate crisis. So I think that that's absolutely essential. There's one more point I would like to make, which is that we have a massive amount of disinformation about climate change, which has been promoted in all sorts of ways, and which is preventing not only governments from acting, but also businesses from acting in their own self-interest to reduce risk and take advantage of opportunities. And so one of the recommendations is always to try somehow to educate people with facts. Facts do count in terms of climate change. And I was very encouraged in yesterday's sessions to see that young man, I don't remember his name, that was a climate quote unquote denier, and that then finally, after some study, realized that there is no actual basis for climate denial from a factual point of view. So sustainable development goals are fabulous. We should use them all the time. Not enough people know about them. And number two, climate denial is something that we need as a strategy to try to ameliorate.
Thank you, Jan. So I just want to say one thing additional about the Sustainable Development Goals and ask Princella for some feedback here. You know, something not everyone realizes is when the US, along with 192 other countries in the UN General Assembly, agreed to the Sustainable Development Goals a couple of months before the Paris Agreement, the agreement was that all of the countries of the UN General Assembly would work together to foster those goals internationally for each other, but also domestically. So the United States government made a commitment that everywhere within the United States, we would have no poverty, no hunger, good health, better education, gender equality. Think about that for a minute and think about how have things played out since then. Right now, in the last couple of months, we're seeing a terrible escalation in hunger in the United States because a lot of the big institutions and big distribution systems aren't really designed to give the American people the Sustainable Development Goals. That's a lesson that we can't really look away from. I just wanted to ask you, Princella, whether it's on that issue or on the other aspects of the SDGs being a domestic commitment for the United States, what could we be doing better in terms of making sure our national, state, county, local policy and community awareness have some consciousness that we want to work towards these things?
So I think a lot of that is going, can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you. Go ahead.
Okay, I think a lot of that is going to be in the messaging, and I just love what everyone's saying. And at the central point of all of that, when we go into communities and we talk about these things, if we could cater that messaging that's sticking to our goals and how all of these things work together, I think we start bringing in a different group of people who climate they may not understand. This is connected to and changing everything. And if we don't solve this, we solve nothing, right? So I really think that that's the answer. I think it's taking those facts, as I heard mentioned, and catering those facts in a way to where local concerns are addressed in areas where they just aren't forming that connection to climate. And I think if we put more time into that, it would have an incredible return, if that's the question you're asking, Joe.
Just unmuting. Yes, I think that's, it could be that we actually have already in the works in our everyday political, furious political discussion in this country, some of the values and some of the elements that would point towards these goals being common national priorities. And it could be that if we, within our own borders, are able to have those conversations, we can foster a different global environment for conversation about development. I think a point that we might all think about in relation to trade and thinking about Ross's reference to the border adjustment and how it can foster better policy abroad. The way that trade works right now, it's not designed to undermine anybody's interests. It's designed to foster more efficient supply chains and better distribution of value. But the reality is a lot of people do get left behind. So this discussion about sustainable development and climate-related trade priorities could be a way of addressing that. And some of the communities that are left behind are not having those conversations. They might be having the conversation that they want less trade, not smarter trade, or that they don't want climate action because they think it's going to harm them somehow. And I think that goes to Jan's point that we want to try to address that and make sure that we have better information, not the sort of emotional pushback that we sometimes get. So I know we're coming up to the end of our hour here. So we have a couple of things to do before we do end. I want to give Lawrence and William a chance to quickly share your perspectives here, and then we're going to have another poll. But Lawrence, why don't you go, and then William, and if you have any additional thoughts, please do start putting them in the chat because we want to make sure we capture everybody's contributions. Go ahead.
Okay, in my lifetime, the population of the world has tripled. And I think everyone has agreed, at least in liberal regimes, that there's no way of enacting birth control, and that the most logical and effective way to reduce the growth of the population is to encourage economic and other equality for women. So I think women's equality is the best single way to address the endless escalation of world population.
Very interesting and very important point, Lawrence. Thank you. William?
It's a difficult thing to say, especially in the climate we're in now with the concern of police brutality and so forth. But it seems to me that the most important thing is to reduce emissions. If we don't reduce emissions by, say, 40, 50% in the next 10 years, according to the IPCC, we've missed the 1.5 goal. So, then we are up to 2 degrees Celsius warming. It's going to continue for 60 years or 70 years, no matter what we do, if we stopped emissions tomorrow. So the urgent task is to reduce emissions. All right, now, the best way that I see to do that is through carbon fee and dividend. In order to do that, you got to have the Republicans. You've got to get them on board. Now, what's the one thing that they're afraid of? They're afraid that the environmental movement, especially climate change, is a ploy, a socialist ploy, to basically move the country towards socialism, towards a more equitable society, right? That's the worst thing. That's the thing they're afraid of. How are you going to approach them if you say the only way to do this is to completely reform society and make a more equitable society? People with a lot of money don't want to hear that. They want to keep on, not only keep the money they've got, they want the pile to get bigger, even if they can't buy anything with it, even if, there aren't that many yachts in the world. So it seems to me that, that we're shooting ourselves in the foot if we start talking about social change, important thing that we should be concentrating on, which is lowering carbon emissions as fast as possible.
Right. So thank you. One note on that subject is that, of course, we can actually build a fair economy if we have incomes going up from dividends, right? So there's a way in which that becomes a middle ground in that discussion. So I know Brett is getting ready to put up the poll again. We're going to look at those same 4 options, and there's going to be a 5th point available this time. So please go ahead and cast your votes. Great. So obviously we gave people an out. It's an easy out, right? All of these are part of the most effective solution. So someone's asking, what is NDC? NDC is a nationally determined contribution to the Paris Agreement, so National Climate Plan. This will inform our report back, but I want to just share very quickly with everybody, you have a real world opportunity right now to help inform the international policy process. I'm going to put it up on the screen. This is the 75th anniversary this year of the United Nations, and they are now making available this opportunity at un75.online. That's the web address, un75.online. There is a survey there where you can actually tell the United Nations what you think the priorities should be for emerging from the global health crisis and the global economic depression that we have suddenly found ourselves in a way where we're better off, more sustainable, more resilient, we have more equitable societies. Thank you everyone for this really great and detailed discussion. Your insights, I think, are very important. And we're going to try to give a report back to the plenary session that's going to help answer these questions that we explored today, and also talk about smart incentives, climate smart investment, reducing risk and enhancing the sharing of benefits, and how those things drive diplomatic cooperation. Again, thank you everyone for participating in this breakout session. We want to keep hearing your thoughts in the chat, and we're going to keep documenting them, and we're going to pull them into a sort of report back to Ross and a way of informing future webinars like this and future education opportunities like this to explore the international policy realm. And so I will just say we are back
Great.
in the main plenary session.
All right, great. Welcome back, everybody. I hope you had a good time and you made some new climate friends in your breakout sessions. For the next half hour, we're going to do some report backs. And so the order of those report backs, and Brad, if you can go to those slides at the end, I'd appreciate it. Order of those report backs are the UN, Africa, small island developing states. I'll do those three, and then Raven will take over and have conversations with Mexico, Canada, and the European Union. So Joe or Princella, I don't know who's going to be your spokesperson here, but would you share for us the 4 options that you considered? And then after that, I'll ask you for some of the reasons that you thought the things your participants polled the way they did. So what were the 4 options you considered, Joe?
Sure. So the 4 options were considering, the U.S. has passed carbon fee and dividend. How can the U.S. best contribute to a constructive international negotiating process? Option 1 was contribute its fair share or better to the Green Climate Fund, which helps to foster climate smart investment overseas. Build climate risk and impact into processes where the U.S. is already a strong leader, the UN Security Council, for instance, or global trade negotiations. Enact world-leading national climate policy under the Paris Agreement, realigning major incentives and investments in all areas of the national economy and trade, or catalyze private sector transformation in energy, agriculture, industry, and transport using incentives like fee and dividend or building on those kind of incentives.
Thank you.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, go ahead. Sorry. I was just going to ask you how those polls came out.
So the first poll came out with roughly 45% each for items 3 and 4. So strong national policy or private sector transformation. There wasn't as much support for using the Green Climate Fund to foster a better global negotiating process or maximize U.S. leverage. And the same was true of using geopolitical influence. But in the discussion, it came out that several people who selected 3 or 4 were thinking about the practicalities of policy transformation, but really did have strong support for the others as well. Using geopolitical leverage, number 2, for instance, could help to influence countries that might not be all that responsive to the climate negotiations. Russia was mentioned in relation to the Security Council. And of course, major oil exporters, including Russia, but maybe also Saudi Arabia, could be examples where trade could be an effective leverage point. And then there was some thought about, can the Green Climate Fund essentially incentivize the maximization of climate-related investment across whole economies, not just have targeted investments. We also then discussed the Sustainable Development Goals, and participants were asked to choose a number of goals that are complementary to climate action. Think about how and why they're important. A major priority that came up was empowering women through education, investment, incentives, giving women the space to lead, reducing inequalities, could actually have very powerful impacts on sustainability goals across whole societies, and also could effectively change domestic politics, economic priorities, and geopolitics. There's something very much stronger to explore there. We gave people an out in a second poll where we essentially said, could all of these be part of the best solution? And that was by far the winner. 70% essentially said, yes, you have to have the US investing in the rest of the world. You have to be building climate into all leverage points diplomatically. The US should have a nationwide whole economy NDC, and private sector transformation should be catalyzed across all sectors with targeted smart incentives building on the leverage of fee and dividend. So the world wants you, Secretary Astoria, to get all that done.
I'll get on it right away. Thanks, Joe. And I was listening in on that discussion. Thank you all. David, Michael, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
And if we could get the slide to the Africa slide. How are you doing, David, Michael?
I'm doing very well, and we had a great breakout session as well. So we did just one poll, but the result was quite good, and we had very useful discussion and some kind of adjustment to the poll. So what came top was capacity building on climate finance and green investment in Africa. So this goes back to what Joe was talking about, the US investing in other parts of the world. So we need capacity building on climate finance and green investment on the continent of Africa. And during our discussion, a few persons say that we don't have the infrastructure to implement a carbon fee and dividend yet, because we don't even know how many we are. We don't know the number of people, the beneficiaries, how will they be captured. So it's only through a very good capacity building and a green investment portfolio that that can be achieved. Now, what came second was that I think many of the women in the room and those who are very gender sensitive asked that aid be given to women who in small and medium scale green businesses. So everyone agreed that women are most vulnerable to climate change. And for us to achieve the sustainable development goals, we must empower women. And the only way we can do that is to give them aid and support. What came third was suspension of carbon border adjustment for African countries. And a good observation from one of our participants said he would rather suggest that the border carbon adjustment should not be suspended for African countries. That's the US should collect the money, but give back the money to Africa. So that was quite interesting. And then the last one is the technology transfer, which encompasses renewable energy, clean energy for cooking, and all others. That was how we did in Africa. Thank you.
And David, Michael, can I ask a follow-up question? I'm surprised that it was technology transfer the last on the poll. I'm a little surprised on that. And I'm thinking of that conversation that you and I had earlier about solar cooking stoves. And I thought that might have been, moved that one a little higher up the list. Did that come up?
Yes, but many of these issues, I agree with you, but many of these issues are demand driven. So if you make a green investment in providing clean energy for cooking for people, and it's affordable, they will definitely go for it. At the moment, women are using firewood to cook, causing effect on their health and deforesting our little forest that is left because they don't have an alternative. So if you provide an alternative in terms of a business, not just giving aid, then you solve the problem. So I strongly believe this is why capacity building on finance and green investment came tops.
All right, excellent. Thank you. It was great to see you and great working with you.
Yeah.
Mike Roman or Chris Balos, I don't know who I'm speaking with next, but you're up.
Hi, this is Mike Maori
Hi, Mike.
and Yahweh from the Pacific Island nations of Kiribati and Marshall Islands. Our group judged on 4 different options. Support the passage of the Markey and Velasquez Climate Displaced Persons Bill. Support aggressive mitigation of the US and other countries to contain global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Support global push for a legally defined climate refugee. There is no such thing today. Support the purchase of lands abroad and immigration services for at-risk populations. Our group chose 3 of the 4 options. The first poll that we went to, the winner was to support aggressive mitigation, maintaining everything down below the 1.5 degrees Celsius. Famous saying that we have is 1.5 to stay alive. When we came back, we were a little bit more split. the group decided it was a tie between support passage of Marquis and Velasquez's climate displaced persons bills, and then also support purchase of lands abroad and immigration services for at-risk populations. So it was interesting. I think for our group, they heard about climate refugees, but didn't understand that it wasn't a real thing, at least legally. It wasn't a legally defined concept. And I think for some of our group members, it was the first time they heard about these small island nations. So it was a good discussion and a good, awareness raising of what's happening in the islands.
Thank you, Mike. And if I could ask two follow-up questions. The first is, it seemed like at first with the first poll, it looked like people were thinking, all right, if we mitigate, then we won't have as many climate refugees. I was wondering if it seemed to you people changed their mind, that is, we're going to have climate refugees anyway, or it's too late to not have climate refugees. And then would you remind us of about how many people we're talking about from small island developing states who are going to need to leave their home and find a new one because of sea level rise and climate change?
Okay. Again, that term climate refugee, there is no such thing as a climate refugee defined by the Refugee Convention in the 1950s. So we would first need to define what a climate refugee is. Obviously for us, we have no country, we have no villages, we have no homes because of the seas and the impacts of the environment that's changing. As far as how many people we're talking about, just from the endangered coral atoll nations alone, there's 5, Maldives, Kiribati, Tokelau, Tuvalu, and the Marshall Islands. We are looking at around 750,000 people today. It's not a lot of people, but that's 5 nations of and entire populations of humans that people don't know about, and you can't care about what you don't know about. So baby steps for baby feet. We're just trying to tell people our situation and that we exist.
We got a couple more minutes here, so I'm wondering if you might say something about the purchase of lands abroad. And I know for in Kiribati, the concept of land is important, and home. So was that controversial? Did a lot of people go for that option?
Chris is here in the United States from the Marshall Islands, and he brought up the immigration services for people who arrive in different countries. Land, the concept of land, is there's a cosmological connection between person, place, and land. When you're born on your land that has been handed down for thousands of years in your family. We were traveling and people in the Pacific 10,000 years ago, thousands of years before Europeans decided the world was actually not flat. So land, you're born on it, you live on it, you have children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren. When you die, you return to that land to join the ancestors, Ikarawa or above, to watch over the land for future generations. Well, what climate change is doing is it is taking away that land. It is salinizing the water. It is causing great erosion, trees, bushes, land, everything. The hungry tide takes what it takes and it doesn't return. Even graves get washed away of our grandparents, of our great-grandparents. So when you talk about land for us, you're really talking about genocide, and that's an ecological genocide that we all have been faced with. I had this bottle. This is the water that my family members had to drink from. This is from our well when the sea washed over the land. You cannot live without fresh water. And it's the urgency of now. We don't have time to wait for things to happen eventually down the road. We first started talking about this in 1989 at the Conference on Sea Level Rise in Malie Island in the Maldives. It's been 31 years that we've been saying we need help.
I really appreciate your contribution and thanks for being here. Raven in Mexico, you're up.
Who is speaking from the Mexico delegation?
So there will be two of us speaking, me and Stephanie.
Wonderful, welcome. I'd love to hear what are some of the options that your group discussed?
Yes, so we started discussing 4 different options. One was like, well, as Mexico already exceeds or meets the U.S. mitigation, encourage U.S. to suspend the border carbon adjustment for imports from our country. The second one is linking the emission trading system from California and Mexico. The third one was to support the creation of a global carbon incentive fund, which for the people that were not in the session is establishing a threshold, and the countries that emit above it has to financially compensate the ones that emit below it. And then the fourth one was like, okay, US, thank you for calling. Just like do your NDC and then we'll talk. So we, no one selected that. So everyone here wants to engage with US. So we had like everyone selected from the 3 different polls. I'm just gonna give you, so there was some changes. So in the first one, we had that the most of the participants selected the Global Carbon Incentive Fund. And then in the second time of the repo, most of the people talk about the emission trading linkage between California and Mexico. And Steph will talk to us more about the arguments for that.
Yes, hi. So I'm Stephanie, and I would like to thank everyone here for the opportunity to have this interaction. As a representative of Mexico, I would like to pursue linking the ETS of California and Mexico, but we will not stop there. We would like to go even further and link it to Quebec's system, pushing Mexico to do more. What we need is more action and less talking. So this, we feel like it's gonna push us to do action now, and also have a better trade between our nations. This is an ambitious goal, but if we achieve it, we will automatically elevate our ETS to among the best in the world. So that will be very good. We have the legal framework in place. We just need to really work on it and also involve citizens so that we have a participation in observation and scrutiny to avoid corruption.
Wonderful, thank you so much for sharing. Unfortunately, I'd love just to hear a very quick word. We just have a minute left. What shifted support away, or were there concerns about the Global Carbon Incentive Fund that it sounds like the group moved away from, or was there just that much excitement for the ETS?
Yes, well, we felt like the proximity of Mexico and California will be one of the key issues that we will pursue that one, and action now.
Yeah. Thank you so much for the work that you put into that and for sharing with the rest of the group. I am excited to invite the Canadian delegation to share what they've been discussing.
Hi there. I'm Marlo, and I'll represent the Canadian delegation. We had 5 options to choose from to engage with the United States. Number 1 is work with the United States. Hang on. With the UNFCCC to ensure all climate projects respect the rights of Indigenous peoples. Second was ask the USA to join the Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition. The third one is apply directly to the World Trade Organization for border carbon adjustments between the United States and Canada. Number 4 was begin discussions with the US and Mexico to revise the new NAFTA to include carbon pricing and other mitigation measures, and engage with the US after it has enhanced and submitted its nationally determined contributions. And when we started our discussion, we took a poll, and it was pretty evenly split what we wanted to do between these 5 options. But after learning a bit more about all these options and having our breakout sessions, what we decided we were most comfortable with was number 3, apply directly to the world, number 4, begin discussions with the US and Mexico to revise the new NAFTA. And the reason for this is that we are very close trading partners. Canada exports a lot of oil to the US, and it would be good for us to get our own house in order and be able to harmonize our carbon pricing policies as much as possible. This could serve as a good model for bringing these border carbon adjustments to the greater world as well. So we think that's a great start to have. So we can have this model and be able to figure out how we can harmonize these as best as possible within our own small group.
How fortunate that we were just discussing with the Mexican delegation how they want to harmonize with the US and Canadian carbon prices as well. So it sounds like all three players in North America have some common interests here. What what I would be interested, were there concerns about any of the other four options that directed you to the North American organization, or what changed in that discussion?
Right.
You're weighing pros and cons.
Right. We definitely became more uncomfortable with number 3, which was applying directly to the World Trade Organization for border carbon adjustments. We discussed that as a single Canadian delegation, it would be difficult to have border carbon adjustments because it's very complicated diplomatically, and it will take a long time. So I think that's why we steered more towards having it more within our own little group as opposed to going straight to the World Trade Organization.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I guess we've seen pretty recently how flexible that North American free trade discussions can be and how quickly they can change on a dime sometimes when the incentives are right. That's really wonderful. Thank you so much for all the work that y'all put into that, and thank you for sharing with the group. And I'm excited to invite the European Union delegation to share some of their thoughts.
Thank you very much. Before I go into the 4 different options, let me give you a little bit of a background. So we first discussed the different climate policies the EU has. One of them is being an ETS and then being national targets for reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. We also discussed ongoing discussion in the EU for hopefully much more ambitious mitigation of climate change. So on that background, the 4 different options were suspend the US BCA as EU mitigation meets or exceeds US mitigation. Number 2, negotiate a bilateral treaty that forms a carbon club between the EU and the US and suspends the BCA of both. Third, link the extended EU ETS with California and Quebec cap and trade systems via the defined requirements. And option number 4, continue discussion with China and offer to engage with the US after EU and China agree their negotiation, or come to an agreement, I should say. We had a pretty clear winner before and after the discussion, and that was number 2. But what we heard in the discussion from all participants was that this was not about the Europe wanting the US BCA suspended for economic reasons, but really to drive ambition forwards together. And this was, I think, the main reason why people chose number 2. Another comment we heard was to not stop at these treaties on the formal aspect, but go back to the science and see what needs to be adjusted to move forward. And I'm quite happy to say that from the EU, from the Green Deal, there's a component of green or climate change diplomacy. I don't remember the exact words, and I think that fits pretty well with what we discussed in the group. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. You said some things need to change going forward to enter the carbon club, so I'd be interested to hear more. What are some of those things that need to change, and what does membership in this vision of the carbon club entail?
That's a great question, which we didn't discuss in great detail. I guess it would be, so that's my personal answer here. I'm not speaking for the whole group, but that would mean to have similar ambitions and similar measures in place for the different sectors. It doesn't have to be in exactly the same mechanism as long as it achieves the same goals in the different parts of the economy. And that would allow us to form a carbon club without border carbon adjustments.
Brilliant. And lots of opportunities to expand from bilateral to a larger global multilateral carbon club as well. Continue to grow that momentum. All right. Thank you all so much. And then I'm going to hand it back to Ross to close us out.
Thanks, Raven, and thank you, everybody. That was a wonderful. I wish I'd been able to listen in on all of the discussions. It sounded like there was some great stuff going on. And what's going on in Europe is the EU Commission is seeking input on the EU Green Deal, and CCL Europe has an opportunity for you to participate in that. And so we've got a slide here, and it's got the contact information for James Collis. If you want to participate in this, just send him an email. We will also be sending out an email today or tomorrow thanking you for participating in this session, and we'll include this contact information there.
Sure, I'm happy to do that. So we've just had a great detailed, informed discussion about international policy. This is the 75th anniversary of the United Nations, and the United Nations is asking for your input on how we should emerge better, more sustainably, and more equitably from the current economic and health crisis that we are in. It's an opportunity for you to have a say. Go to un75.online, and you can fill out that survey and help shape global policy in real time. Thank you.
Thanks, Joe. And that's it done. So everybody, thank you for attending, and I hope you learned a lot, and we hope to keep you engaged into the future.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to mute all lines or unmute all lines so that we can all share in this. And again, thank you all for being a part of today's international workshop. We look forward to seeing you on the next Wrap It Up. Have a wonderful rest of your week.
Good job, Ross. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Joe and everyone.
Well done.
Good job, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Citizens Climate Lobby's training program. You can tune into more episodes anywhere podcasts are available. Inspired by what you heard today? Join Citizens Climate Lobby to advocate for bipartisan climate solutions. Go to community.citizensclimate.org to find more trainings, resources, your local chapter, national action teams, discussion forums, and more. Be sure to like our Facebook page and follow us on Twitter and Instagram @CitizensClimate. We also invite all of our listeners to subscribe to our YouTube channel for more inspiration. And together, we are creating the political will for a livable world.